This week, we'll be exploring unsolved mysteries that range from one of the most horrific, tragic string of murders in the last 50 years, to one of the most controversial and infamous football decisions ever made in any World Cup match, to the eerie cases of these strange ghost phone calls received in Akita city in Japan. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is fennel tea, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries iceberg. San Francisco John Doe number 60. So this was the body of a young man found in 1985, San Francisco. Now this wasn't exactly your normal John Doe, your normal body that was found. I mean, not that there's really a normal for finding a dead body, but this one showed signs that whoever it was, he had been horrifically tortured and mutilated before his death. He was found wrapped inside of a blanket and shoved underneath a semi-truck on the streets of a local downtown market. From what they could tell from the body, he was a white guy. He was around 5'5" and weighed around 130 pounds, or around 60 kilos give or take. His hands were actually tied and bound behind his back with guitar string, and as I said, the marks on his body were really just horrific. He had several cuts and burns all over his body. He had apparently hot wax poured into his eyes, and his precious parts had been horribly mutilated. So yeah, just a horrific way to go and a horrific crime. And on top of all that, on his chest, the young man had an upside down pentagram carved into it. So immediately the first thought of the law enforcement was that maybe this was something to do with a cult ritual or a sacrifice or something like that. So they did their best to try and maybe contact local occult members, or to try and maybe find different suspects who were into that sort of thing. But they weren't able to identify the man himself, hence being a John Doe, and so it was a little hard to try and track and investigate who he knew, where he was from, what links to occult rituals that he might have had. And so they did their investigations, but nothing really got anywhere, and the case basically lay cold for about 2 years. And that is when things start to get a little bit complicated. So after about 2 years, police start looking into this guy called Maurice Bourque, who had at the time been accused of robbery and kidnapping, and one of his apparent victims had a pentagram carved into his chest, and this victim identified Maurice as the person who did it to him. And so the authorities thought that these cases were somewhat similar, and so they had Maurice as a potential suspect for the John Doe killing. But that's at this point about as far as they went with it, as there really wasn't too much evidence for the John Doe killing, so by extension there wasn't actually too much linking Maurice and this original murder, at least nothing that would hold up in court. But he was wanted for a few crimes up in Canada and for his, as I mentioned earlier, robbing and kidnapping case, and so he was arrested, he was sent to jail, and after being in jail for around about a year, he willingly, actively contacted the police on his own and said that he wanted to resolve an unsolved murder. And when they asked what case and who this was, he said that it was the murder of John Doe number 60. So he was brought in and questioned about this, and he actually blamed his ex-boyfriend, Maurice's ex-boyfriend, and said that it was his ex who tortured and killed this John Doe, and Maurice had helped him hide and cover up the body. So this is like very wild already. Like, it does seem a bit strange that Maurice would willingly contact the police and basically admit to something as heinous as this. Like, I know he said that he didn't do the killing or he didn't do the torturing, but still, being an accessory to something like this and hiding the body is still fairly bad, and it'd probably net you a decent few years in prison. But maybe he was just trying to get ahead of it in case they ever got proper evidence, and in case he was ever caught for it. Maybe he wanted to make a plea deal or something like that. Maurice's ex was a man named Clifford Joseph, and he worked as a waiter in San Francisco, as well as generally trying to help the needy. He often opened his doors to people who were homeless or struggling or young or some combination of those three, you know, giving them a place to stay so they don't have to sleep on the street sort of thing. And while this looks and sounds very noble and very kind, Maurice told police that this was basically just a front, and he was actually a super bad guy who would lure in homeless people, vulnerable people, and, you know, do some pretty messed up stuff to them. So at this point, it's like, who do you believe? It's kind of like two different statements against each other sort of thing. Both could logically be true, and there wasn't really much evidence connecting anyone to the murder or the torture. So police at this time kind of had their hands tied. Clifford was eventually taken in, he was interviewed, and he was charged with not just this crime, but a few other crimes that had taken place since this initial killing. There were a few witnesses brought in who were some of the times current tenants of Clifford, some of the time ex-tenants or ex-boyfriends or people who knew Clifford, just kind of character witness sort of things. And honestly, some of these witnesses seemed like very unhinged, strange individuals themselves, with one guy claiming to have been involved in a secret assassination of someone high up in the government, and he also claimed to have had sexual relationships with both Elton John and Liberace, which, like, yeah, of course he did. But these were the types of witnesses that they were dealing with. Basically, the evidence was very thin and circumstantial. The accusation by Maurice might have just been out of malice or spite or just to get revenge for something. The witnesses and character witnesses were either a little nutty themselves or was very thin on the surface, and the whole case just seemed a little flimsy and thin. But it still went through, and Clifford was charged and found guilty of this murder and was sentenced to 34 years to life in the Folsom State Prison. And Clifford has never admitted to any of this. He maintained his innocence from the start, all throughout the trial, and ever since. Which, I mean, I know a lot of criminals do maintain their innocence, so it's not exactly a huge deal, but it is just something to note. Some people do genuinely believe that Clifford is innocent. As I said, the witness testimony was a little flimsy and weak, and the actual physical evidence tying him to the crime was very flimsy and shaky and thin. For instance, one of the only pieces of physical evidence they found were these bloodstains in Clifford's home that matched the same blood type as John Doe number 60. And that was kind of all. But obviously, if Clifford is letting people into his home and opening up his home, then the blood could really have gotten there in any number of ways, especially considering Maurice was staying there. And so if he had just killed this guy in the house or nearby, if they were doing all this without Clifford's knowledge sort of thing, then it could very well have gotten past him. Or it could be that he was home all the time and so obviously knew about this bloodstain, and so the jury thought that he was, if not the perpetrator, at least an accessory to whatever happened. So it's a strange one. John Doe number 60 has never actually been identified, which is incredibly sad, and this horrific case basically ends without a conclusion. I think the people who likely did this are at least now behind bars, so maybe it does have somewhat of a just ending, but still we never did find out who the John Doe was. The 1966 triple murder of Hendersonville. So this was a wild, brutal case. It took place obviously in 1966 in North Carolina, and it shook the entire local town for weeks and months to come. So our story starts with two men, Charles Hill and Larry Shipman, who were disposing of some tree branches and some tree limbs that they cut down. They threw them in their truck and were disposing of them in this little grassy patch off a side road, which was apparently a common area that people went to, dump stuff in. So they went here to dump the branches, and they saw what looked like mannequins. So very creepy at first. They went up to the mannequins, looked a little closer, and then they realized that they weren't mannequins. These were the dumped bodies of Louise Davis Shoemate, Charles Glass, and Vernon Shipman. They were all beaten to death, all suffered head wounds, and all had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. Now, Vernon and Charles were actually connected, not by blood, but by occupation and by relationship. The two men were romantic partners and were also business partners, owning and running a local music store. But Louise was a factory worker that seemed to have no connection to the men or to the case. And things did get a little stranger when they did more investigating. But for now, people were wondering, what the heck was going on here? Why were these three people killed and by who? And was this part of a random impulsive killing? Or was this some sort of serial killer that might strike again? Nobody really at the time knew. These were, by all accounts, very good, liked people that were killed. They were all very close to the community community, the music store that the two men were running was very popular, especially with the youth, and they were the type of people that basically had no enemies, so them being killed in this manner was extremely shocking. So after this, the entire community just basically went on edge. Everyone was suspicious like 24/7, they were locking their doors, they would pick their kids up straight from school, they wouldn't allow their kids to go outside and play. It was really just a horrible time. And the lack of general evidence for this led to there being quite a few of different theories for what actually happened and why and who actually committed these murders. One theory was that Vernon and Charles were killed because they were gay. So apparently it was like a hate crime sort of thing, which I mean is a possible theory, I guess, but the two men weren't really hated or despised within the town. You know, most people seemed to really like the music store, they thought that they were great guys, and nobody really had a problem with them. Another theory was that because Charles was into the occult sort of things, where he was into, you know, voodoo stuff and hexes and spells and potions, that maybe he had tried to hex or he scammed the wrong person maybe, and then that person got revenge on him and his partner, which again is probably always a possibility, or that this was just a crime of passion in the moment, or that it was a serial killer. So there was a few different theories on the two men, but as I said, the woman wasn't really connected to the two men at all, so it is thought that she probably wasn't the main target of the killings, and that perhaps she had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, stumbled across the event, stumbled across the bodies, and she was sadly taken out alongside them. And as for suspects, as for motives, as for evidence, it was a series of kind of unfortunate events. To begin with, there wasn't actually too much physical evidence anyway, and over the years, due to poor handling or to confusion, a lot of the already sparse evidence ended up going missing or being lost or being corrupted, and so eventually over X amount of time, there was actually very little evidence to show for the case. But a few of the investigators that were close to the case have said, and they believed, even up until their dying day, that a man named Edward Thompson Jr. was responsible for these killings. He was a man who had been on a quite recent spree of murder, kidnapping, and assault, and the Times News posted an article during this spree that said that any citizen that sees him may arrest him on sight or to kill him if he resists without being subject to legal action, which is just an insane thing to post in a newspaper, by the way, but Times News did it. So Thompson sent a letter to the Times News saying that, like, yeah, you think writing about me is fun? Alright, I'll give you something to write about. And then this triple murder happened. A bunch of the details in this case and in similar crimes that Thompson committed were quite similar in nature, and Thompson had apparently admitted to a bunch of people at the time, both in and out of jail, that he had actually committed these murders. Now again, whether he was telling the truth on these or whether it was just a bragging thing, you know, taking credit for it to up his body count sort of thing, which does happen, but either way, he was a major suspect for these. And on top of all that, he was actually in and around Hendersonville at the time that the murders were committed. So that's the main suspect that a lot of people do believe committed these. But there were a few other suspects, one for example being Jim Burrows, who actually also confessed to the murders. But most people believe that it was Thompson who genuinely committed them, but he was never charged for them. And a short while later, Thompson died in prison. So with a lot of people believing that Thompson committed them, and with Thompson already being dead, it seemed like there was kind of no one to charge. And so no one ever was charged for these three murders. And this is where today this case still lies. I think it's unlikely to ever be solved or concluded, as it seems like Thompson probably committed the murders, but you obviously can't charge a dead man. So a bit of a strange case, a very sad and tragic case, and rest in peace to these three lovely souls. 1966 World Cup Finals Ghost Gold. So this is an interesting one. Picture the scene. It's 1966 World Cup Final. England versus Germany. After 90 minutes, full time, the score is 2-2. So they go into extra time, and then this happens.
Here's Ball running himself back.
Jeff Hurst gets the ball with a wonderful cross and then knocks it straight into the German goal, scoring his second goal of the match. Or so it seems. This goal was seemingly so close to the actual goal line that it was massively disputed at the time. The Germans were obviously saying it didn't count as a goal, it didn't go over the line, it bounced off the top bar, and the English were celebrating like mad because they believed that it was a goal, and the goal did end up going to England, making the score 3-2 at the time, and then they later went on to score another goal, making it 4-2 by the end of the match. Jeff Hurst scored a hat-trick in that game, and won England their first ever World Cup. But back then, and even since then, there have obviously been tons of debates and arguments and back and forth about whether that goal actually counted, and how if they didn't score that goal, maybe they wouldn't have scored the second one, and Germany might have actually won the World Cup that year. So yeah, very interesting one, bit of a fun one, so let me know where you stand on this. The AEW World Championship theft. This one is a little unusual and a little bit funny in a way. Chris Jericho, who was a professional wrestler, was crowned the All Elite Wrestling Champion. He was awarded and given the champion's belt and was traveling home at the time for his well-deserved rest and break. The flight that he was on had to land a little sooner and a little shorter due to bad weather, so Chris decided to hire a limo driver and to drive him and his group the rest of the way home. So he called up the limo driver arrived, and he basically put all of his stuff inside the limo. Belongings, clothes, suitcases, and the AEW Championship belt that he had been awarded. On the way home, they decided to stop off at a steakhouse, because, I mean, all good wrestlers need steak. But this is where things started to go a little bit wonky. Chris had actually taken the wrong luggage from the airport. So they made some arrangement while Chris and his group went into the steakhouse to have some drinks, have a meal. The limo driver would drive back to the airport and swap out the luggage Chris had taken with his actual luggage. And the limo driver then came back to the steakhouse, went in, had a little chat with Chris, went back out, and then he came in a second time later on and told Chris that the championship belt had been stolen. Like, just straight out of the limo, apparently. First, Chris accused the limo driver himself of actually stealing the belt, and he was like, I didn't steal anything, I'm just a limo driver. But then he asked the limo driver if, when he had come into the steakhouse the first time, if he had left the limo open or if he had locked it. And the driver said that he didn't remember locking it and he probably just left it open when he went into the steakhouse. Which, it's like, why wouldn't you lock your limo if you're leaving it? It kind of doesn't make sense, especially if you're a professional limo driver. So they called the police, they did some interviews, they filed a report for the missing belt, and it was only actually days later when the belt turned up, because someone reported it in, as they said they saw it in the middle of the road as they were just driving down. And so they stopped, picked up the belt, and then called up the police and handed it in. But before turning it into the police, the guy who found it posted it on the local lost and found page on Craigslist. Like, how do you even think to put a championship belt onto the lost and found on Craigslist? Like, it's actually comical. But another twist in this is that the road that the guy apparently found the belt on wasn't a road that the limo had actually driven down. Like, it wasn't on their route from the airport to the steakhouse, so they honestly had no clue how the belt even got there if the guy was telling the truth and that's where he found it. So did he actually somehow find the belt in the middle of the road? Did he take it from the limo? And if he did take it from the limo, was the limo driver in on it? Like, he left the doors open, called a friend to come take the belt, and then they just kind of bailed on the idea when they knew it was getting too serious. And so they made up this story about finding it in the road and then turned it in. We really don't know. The belt ended up getting returned, everything kind of went back to normal, and so a somewhat light-hearted one, but still a mystery nonetheless. Akita City empty house calls. So this is apparently a somewhat common occurrence in Japan, as well as to an extent worldwide, where these ghost calls essentially are made to a fire brigade, and when the fire brigade eventually tracks down the call and finds the house that the call was made from, they show up there and normally there's nobody home. The doors are all locked, the lights are all turned off, and when they go inside the house to investigate, the phone is, on the latch, it's put down, it's not hanging or anything. So all in all, this is very strange. The person on the other end of the phone, the emergency services operator, they tend to hear just like buzzing and or crackling. And the typical protocol is to, when you get no response, to hang up and then to try and call the number back. And then if it doesn't pick up, then they send out the fire brigade. So these types of occurrences normally happen a few times a year, like maybe once or twice on average, and they are often just blamed on like faulty phone lines. But in 2014, in the city of Akita, these ghost calls spiked from, as I said, like once or twice per year up to 9 times in just a few months. And nobody has figured out who or what actually made these phone calls. Were they made by ghosts around the city for various reasons? Were they simply, faults in the phone lines? Or were they caused by a human error? A phone operator maybe making a mistake in the lines? Or by doing it on purpose and making these faulty calls themselves? We don't really know, at least for now. So this kind of strange, kind of spooky case is, at least until we call the Ghostbusters in, a mystery. Alex Sloley was a 16-year-old boy who disappeared in London, actually not too far from where I am, which is a little troubling, but this was in 2008, and Sloley at the time was staying in a friend's house in northern London. And on the 2nd of August, he left his friend's house to return home for his 17th birthday, and he was just never seen again. He wasn't caught on any CCTV footage. He had very little, if not no, money on him. He didn't take his passport, he didn't take a change of clothes, and his phone stopped sending out signals soon after he disappeared. It was a very, very strange case, but there sadly, honestly, wasn't too much to go off. He was a student in London, and his disappearance initially was put onto him just running away, or being killed by a gang that he owed money to or something, or just a whole range of theories. And I think Alex running away is one of the most unlikely theories, as if you are genuinely running away, you would just take everything with you. I mean, maybe you leave your phone so like you can't be tracked, but why wouldn't you take your passport, your cash, at least a change of clothes? Like, there's no reason not to take that. So I think that's a completely absurd theory. He could have been the victim of a serial killer of some kind, or of a gang attack. And not that he was necessarily in a gang, but there were some rumors that he maybe owed some money to 1 or 2 people who were in a gang, and maybe he just kind of caught the wrong end of the stick. The fact that there was no CCTV footage whatsoever makes this a very strange case, as there are CCTV cameras on every tube station, train station, etc., even buses in London. So it seems like he just walked out the front door of his friend's house and then just disappeared into thin air. And as of today, 16 years later, this case is still unsolved and still remains a mystery. Andrew Gosden was, strangely, even though this tier of the iceberg is ordered alphabetically, he was actually thought to be connected to our previous entry, Alex Sloley. So Andrew Paul Gosden was 14 years old at the time, and he was living in Doncaster, South Yorkshire. On September 14th, 2007, Andrew withdrew £200 cash from his bank account, and he bought a one-way ticket from Doncaster to King's Cross Station. That day, he packed a bunch of his clothes, his wallet, his keys, and his PSP. But strangely enough, he actually left his PSP charger at home. And he also left at home £100 cash that he had from like savings from birthdays and stuff, which is very odd. It's like, if you're taking £200 out from the bank account, why not instead just take £100 out and use the £100 cash that you have? Or why not take all the money you have? So yeah, that part's a little strange. He left his house and got to the local train station at around 9 AM that day. And again, very strangely, his ticket from Doncaster down to London cost £31.40. And the return ticket, so to go from Doncaster down to London and then back up home to Doncaster, cost only 50 pence more, which the woman at the counter selling him the ticket made him aware of. And he basically didn't care. He said, no, just give me the single ticket. So it doesn't seem like he was looking to come back to Doncaster, at least not anytime soon. But if he wasn't looking to come back, which is kind of enforced by the idea that he took a bunch of his clothes with him, as you wouldn't really take, a bunch of clothes if you were just going out for the day. But if he were planning to go away for a long time, if not permanently, why not take the PSP charger or the extra cash that he had in his room? It's like there's some very conflicting ideas here. Nobody knows why he went, who he was meeting, if anyone, or where he ended up. He was seen on CCTV camera arriving at King's Cross and leaving through the main exit, but after that, he was never seen again. Now, the entire day of his disappearance was like super chaotic, and there was tons of mistakes made by various people, but they didn't know it at the time. As I said, Andrew left his house in the morning, and instead of going to school, he went to the local train station. And while he was on the train down to London, he was obviously supposed to be in school, so the school ended up calling his parents and saying that he was absent from school and, asking where he was, if he was sick, etc. But his parents didn't pick up, so they just left them a message, and that was it. But the school hadn't apparently even called his parents. They were apparently going down the list of names and then, following it along over to get the parents' phone number, and I guess they tracked wrongly with their finger, and so they called the number of the parents below the number they should have called, and these parents weren't in or they didn't pick up, and so the school left a message to the wrong parents. So come evening time, when Andrew's family all came home, they didn't know for quite some while, until like dinner time, that Andrew wasn't here. He was quite a quiet kid and would often, come home from school, go upstairs and just play video games for a while, so it wasn't that unusual for him, not to be present in the evening. But when they went upstairs to, check on him and found that he wasn't there, that's when they started to get worried. They called his friends, they called any local places that he might be, and nobody had seen him, and they had also said that he wasn't even in school that day. Then they found the mistake that the school made in calling the wrong parents, and so it was thought that perhaps Andrew had maybe got lost or injured or been kidnapped on the way to school. So they spent days driving his route to school, checking in local parks and canals, until 3 days later they actually found out that Andrew had bought the ticket down to London, and so obviously they assumed he went straight there from the house. And then they found the CCTV footage in King's Cross and confirmed that he had actually gotten off and left the station. So the reasons and theories for this one are actually quite varied. One theory says that he wanted to, run away and reinvent himself, and so he fled to London to do that. One says that he was kidnapped somewhere in London, and then there are theories about why he actually went to London in the first place. Obviously, there's the one we mentioned earlier about him just wanting to get away and reinvent himself. Another theory said that he had actually gone down to London to see a live metal band by the name of Sixth. He was apparently quite a big fan of this type of music, and this was a super cool band that was playing at a venue nearby and on that day. So maybe he, bunked school, planned to go down to London for the day, see the band, and then either stay the night somewhere in London or head back to Doncaster the same day. He apparently had a bunch of friends and family in London, so it wouldn't be that unusual for him to, arrange a place to stay or something like that. And his dad said that he might have possibly even gone down there just for sightseeing, as he did tend to like London. So yeah, a very sad case that was never solved. Andrew was never found. There was no real footage of him found outside of the CCTV train station footage, although there were a few rumored sightings of him, either on the day or in the following few days, kind of in and around central London. But these were never really fully followed up on, so we can't confirm whether they're true or not. 17 years on, and this case has yet to be solved, but hopefully it will be soon. Antimatter comets. So this is a hypothesized idea that says that comets, these icy, rocky things flying through space, can sometimes be made out of entirely, purely antimatter. The idea was thrown around in the 1940s, and honestly, there's not too much basis for it. It never really went past the hypothesized stage, and the idea was that these comets, which were made out of antimatter and would begin to break down as they came into the Earth's atmosphere, as, they were getting closer to regular matter, and so that was why they were breaking up and potentially exploding, as opposed to the standard accepted belief of it's just the heat and the friction and the gravity, etc., that acts on the comet. They were also theorized to be the explanation for gamma ray bursts and for stuff like ball lightning, but these links at the time were honestly quite weak, and there are, at least now, much better explanations for these phenomena. So yeah, this one's probably more sci-fi than sigh, but it might make for a cool story plot. The Aquatic Ape Hypothesis. So this is, to me, a really fun one. This is the theory, or hypothesis if you will, that says that humans, or rather our ancestors, split off from the standard line of apes into the shallow waters. This apparent split and then later convergence back onto land did, according to this theory, help us survive and flourish. So the idea is we were all on land like the other apes, and for some reason we got pushed off the land closer and closer to water. Then we became like, not fishers or anything, but we apparently hunted fish in the water, hunted shellfish and clams, and this led to a few things. One being our relative hairlessness, as you know, the more something is in water, the less hairy it becomes, I guess. Like think of dolphins and whales, say. And another trait was us walking on 2 feet. The idea was that if you're in shallow waters and you're hunting fish and stuff, it's a lot easier to stand on 2 feet, you're a lot lighter, and so this basically helped us develop and allowed us to walk on 2 feet when on land. And the main proponent for this theory, biologist Alistair Hardy, said that this also explains how we developed early tools. As he said, in this theory, we developed early tools in order to, break open shells to, eat the shellfish flesh. And then once we got these abilities of tool making and walking upright and somewhat hairlessness, we then migrated slowly back to land, and these newfound abilities gave us dominance on the land and allowed us to compete and to win and to flourish, and then the rest is history. So a bit of a wild theory, honestly, and the theory isn't too popular or even respected by a lot of prominent biologists, but it is still a possibility, and it is definitely a fun one to think about. The Atlanta murders of 1979 to 1981. So these were a string of murders of young adults and children. Yeah, these were obviously in Atlanta, all within these 2 years. And in 1981, after, experiencing and piecing together and linking a bunch of these murders, the police and the FBI started to really investigate and to even stake out some areas where the killer might be. So they were in a ton of areas, off-roads, forests, fields, obviously not doing it all the time or even covering every single forest, but they thought it was incredibly urgent and important that they do their best to, catch this guy. And one of the areas they staked out was some bridges. And during one of these nights, when they were staking out one of these bridges, the police who were, staking it out in secret, suddenly heard a loud splash. And this was obviously in the water below the bridge. Then they saw a white station wagon kind of pull up and reverse and, drive back along the bridge. And so later down the road, they stopped this station wagon and they started to question the driver. And the person in the car was a man named Wayne Williams, who was a 23-year-old guy who was apparently a music promoter and a professional photographer. He was obviously asked what he was doing, where he was going, etc. And he said that he was on his way to audition a woman called Cheryl Johnson. This was for a singing role apparently, but Cheryl was never actually found or identified or confirmed to even exist at all. So it's thought very likely that he made her up. Police also saw at the time, which this is important for later, they also saw in the car a nylon rope and a pair of gloves, but they didn't take either of them because at this point in time they weren't really arresting him, they were just kind of investigating him. The station wagon actually belonged to Wayne's parents, and because they didn't find anything below the bridge on that night, they ended up letting him go. And it was only 2 days later that the body of Nathaniel Akita was found floating in the water just downstream from where the bridge was. So at this point they kind of put 2 and 2 together and went and arrested Wayne Williams. So with him arrested, they started to interview him and started to investigate him a little more closely. And what they found was honestly quite disturbing. They found witnesses that said that they saw Wayne Williams with Akita, the man who was found in the river, on the night of his disappearance. So that was very suspicious, if not condemning. He had also in previous days and weeks and months been witnessed handing out flyers in various neighborhoods aimed at young people between the ages of 11 and 21, asking them to try out and audition for his band. So I mean, that is incredibly disturbing. They also found that the fibers on his carpet inside of his house actually matched some of the fibers found on a few of the victims. And on top of all that, he failed a polygraph test, which, you know, it's just a polygraph, but as well as all the other stuff, it is pretty convincing. He was eventually convicted of the murder of Nathaniel Akita, the man who was found in the water, and of Jimmy Ray Payne, who was killed earlier in that year. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for these 2 murders, but the total list of murders consists of like 28 in total, and he was never charged for any of these. Now, there are a few different beliefs about how many people exactly Wayne killed, or whether it was some of the Atlanta murders, or most of them, or even all of them. And a lot of people investigating it at the time, now still to this day, say that they think Williams is very, very likely responsible for them. But a few other investigators say that while Williams likely killed some of them, if not even most of them, they think it's quite likely that there were multiple killers involved in these 28 killings. And they say that people don't want to admit this because it means there are multiple killers still out there, which I guess is a very troubling thought. And so that is the current status of these killings. 2 solved and convicted for, and like 26 completely unsolved with no one charged for them and with no justice brought to them. So a very sad set of cases in general, and this was 40 years ago, so it's not too far back, but it is still quite a way back. There is some chance, I guess, that we will, you know, find some DNA evidence or develop some technology to, you know, retroactively determine who killed them, but it is looking less and less likely every year. Fingers crossed that some of these get solved, and rest in peace to all of the lovely, wonderful victims in this horrific case. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you enjoyed this one, guys, even though it did end on quite a tragic case. And as always, thanks for watching.